The Miserable Consequences of Misguided Minimum Wage Mandates by Spencer Marlen-Starr, published on my Medium blog in December 23rd, 2022. Note, this is the final version, the final paper in my upper division technical writing course I took as a mathematics major, before switching to economics while at UC Irvine back in 2016. It is not a current draft of a paper intended for publication in a peer-reviewed journal. It also has not been updated by me to reflect any new lines of scholarship on minimum wage laws since then. Abstract. The aim of this position paper is to make the case that minimum wage regulations are detrimental to the working poor, inexperienced, and low-skilled workers. This is not a fringe position among professional economists. In fact, a majority of economists have agreed that minimum wage laws cause unemployment among unskilled workers for as long as polls of economists have been conducted. Unfortunately, many people who are ignorant of basic economic principles, such as former presidential candidate and current Senator of Vermont Bernard Sanders, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, Robert Reich, who served as Secretary of Labor under President William Clinton, to name only a few, have long clamored for frequent increases in minimum wage rates at federal, state, county, and even city level. In this article, I outline the historical progression of both minimum wage legislation in the United States and of research on its effects by economists. Then I present the standard competitive model of the labor market used in economics textbooks and explicate the predictions that model makes about the consequences of instituting a binding wage floor. After that, the voluminous contributions from the foremost influential minimum wage researchers of the past 3 decades summarize, with emphasis placed on highlighting the differences in approaches and results by 2 of them from those of the other 2. After that, I survey several intriguing and innovative approaches to identifying impacts of minimum wage laws. Executive summary. Minimum wages are a common tool in the proverbial policy toolkit used by governments around the globe at the national, federal, state, territory, county, regional, and even city levels. This is most unfortunate because, according to most of the academic economists who have done scholarly work on the subject, minimum wage laws have several negative unintended consequences. Many of those who publicly support minimum wage legislation appear to be blissfully unaware of the warnings issued by economists who have studied the effects similar policies have had in different places and at different times. According to basic price theory, what is now known as microeconomics, any price floor, that is, a minimum wage being a wage floor, which is a special case of the general concept of price floors, which is set above the equilibrium market price which would have prevailed in the absence of said price floor, inevitably produces a surplus in the market for whichever product the price floor was imposed upon. Surplus has a technical meaning in economics. It refers to a situation in which the desires of buyers to buy and sellers to sell some item are not equated through equilibrating market forces as they usually are. In this context, if there is a surplus of waged labor, that means there are more individuals who are willing and able to supply more of their labor, or any of their labor, on the margin at current wage rates than there are vacant positions available to them from employers who are willing and able to demand more of their labor. That is, hire them or increase the hours of current employees on the margin. Economists see surpluses as inefficient outcomes because the market fails to clear. The basic misconception underlying support for this sort of policy is that prices are a lever which can be adjusted to change values. But prices are not levers. Market prices are metrics which reflect value. Thus, attempting to increase the economic value of workers with low job skills by arbitrarily raising the lowest wage rate you are legally allowed to pay them makes about as much sense as it would to cross out the 101 on a thermometer which just measured the temperature of a boy with a fever and write 97 next to it with a Sharpie, instead, if your goal is to cure his fever. Pretending something inconvenient is not there is not the start of a reliable path to dealing with it. If it were possible to compel businesses to pay all their workers a minimum of $10 per hour without laying off any or going bankrupt, that would be awesome. If it were possible to do that with a $10 minimum wage, why would we not make it $20 per hour, $50 per hour, $300 per hour? The reason we do not do this is because, as economist Thomas Sowell puts it, reality is not optional. Part 1. Introduction. Questions regarding the employment and other effects of minimum wage legislation are among the most widely studied in all of labor economics. Some of the quarrels between minimum wage researchers have gotten quite heated at times. The United States has had a federal minimum wage mandate since the passing of the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, which established a 25-cent hourly minimum wage. However, in its original form, under the FLSA, the minimum wage was only legally binding for, quote, employees engaged in interstate commerce or in the production of goods for interstate commerce, end quote. This sounds quite vague, but to make it a little bit more concrete, it only affected around 2/5 of all workers in the United States at the time. Furthermore, it only applied to a small subset of all the sectors of the American economy, industries such as manufacturing, mining, transportation, and communications. From then on, the types of workers the federal minimum wage applied to kept expanding gradually, more details on this later, until a grandfather clause added in 1990 extended the purview of the minimum wage to encompass almost all waged laborers in the United States. But what is a minimum wage law as seen by an economist in the first place? In its simplest form, a law setting a minimum hourly wage is a statement to workers that unless they can find jobs which pay that hourly wage or more, it is illegal for them to offer their labor to an employer who would otherwise be happy to have it for less. The federally mandated minimum wage rate in the United States was last raised to $7.25 per hour in 2009 and has not been amended since. Luckily, when the minimum wage is not raised over a long period of time, its negative consequences are effectively repealed by inflation. It is important to point out, while the minimum wage is important as an exemplar to help settle debates over theoretical issues in economics, and it is a tragedy for every individual who cannot find gainful employment as a result of its insidious effects, relatively few people at any given time are being paid the federal minimum wage rate. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in 2012, 1.6 million workers earned the federal minimum wage of $7.25, and another 2 million were paid hourly wages lower than that. These 3.6 million workers made up roughly 4.7% of all American workers paid in wages by the hour. This by no means constitutes a majority or even a substantial minority of the US labor force. Moreover, most people who start out earning the minimum wage in a new job in the United States earn at least one raise within their first year if they stay that long working for the same employer. Among those workers who were earning the federal minimum wage several years ago, 2011 for example, extremely few, if any of them, are still being paid the same $7.25 per hour that they were back in 2011. Economic mobility in this country is no urban myth. Studies conducted in the US where specific individuals were tracked over time illustrate the reality of this phenomenon. In other words, almost no one stays static for long, at least according to observable data in terms of their relative or absolute income and wealth status. Wherever minimum wage mandates are established and enforced, a majority or at least a plurality of the workers being paid the minimum wage rate tend to be under the age of 25, many of these workers being teenagers. It is not hard to imagine why young adults and teenagers would be paid lower wages on average than middle-aged adults. There's a strong correlation between years of work experience, productivity, and real wages. Although saying practice makes perfect is not true when interpreted literally, practice can and does tend to make people better. Part 2. Discussion. Wage controls in the standard competitive model of labor markets. In most, if not all, introductory economics courses, students are taught about price controls. The two types of price controls are price ceilings and price floors. Price ceiling is an imposed and enforced price control or restriction, legal or otherwise, on how high of a price can be charged for some product. Conversely, price floor is an imposed and enforced price control or restriction, legal or otherwise, dictating some lower limit on the price which may be charged for some product. The standard explanation is usually done via diagrams, and I do in figures 1 and 2 below. If you want to see figures 1 and 2, you'll have to go to the actual article on my blog. A link to the article is in the notes for the video. Carrying on. As the reader may have guessed, minimum wage laws can be modeled as floors on the price of labor. In other words, wage floors. In the case of wage floors, employees are the suppliers of labor and firms are the consumers. When the minimum wage is set above the equilibrium price for unskilled labor, a surplus in the form of unemployment emerges. Unemployment occurs when there are would-be laborers who are searching for employment but do not currently have a job. A minimum wage rate set above the equilibrium wage induces firms to hire fewer workers, lay off marginal workers, or reduce the hours of current employees. It can also incentivize people who were not in the labor force prior to the imposition of the new minimum wage rate to enter the labor market due to the prospect of higher wages if they can get a job. Both these demand and supply effects together are the fundamental causes of the surplus which ensues. The bottom line on theoretical grounds. If you really want to get technically precise in terms of microeconomic theory, there is no free lunch possible here with the minimum wage. If you impose a minimum wage law somewhere where there was not before, or expand the number of industries and job types covered under an existing minimum wage law, or increase the minimum wage rate imposed and enforced by an existing minimum wage law, that change will cause one of the following things. First possible repercussion: reduction in the employment among low-wage workers. This could be caused by more of them being laid off by their bosses than would have otherwise, or, if no bosses lay off any more minimum wage workers, by more firms which employ large numbers of minimum wage workers as a percentage of their overall workforce, or more precisely, the portion of their overall wage bill devoted to paying the wages of their minimum wage employees, will go bankrupt and exit the market than they would have otherwise. Either way, this is bad for low-skilled workers and those who would like to get a job but don't have many job skills or much work experience. Second possible repercussion: a reduction in on-the-job training provided to new employees with low skills because time is money. So if it costs more money per unit of time to train them, employers will seek to economize by reducing their provision of it. This hurts workers with low skills because some of that training sometimes helps them to get their next job and in their next job after the one which reduces the amount of training provided. Third possible repercussion: higher relative prices for goods and services produced by low-wage workers, which is bad for consumers, in other words, everybody, which includes low-skilled and low-wage workers. In terms of the first of the enumerated possible effects above, it is important to add that there are multiple ways that firms can go about reducing their labor force. First, they can simply produce less output. Second, they can engage in what is called labor-to-labor substitution. That is, substitute a lesser number of workers with higher skills, high enough for their marginal revenue product to be equal to or above the new minimum wage rate, to produce the same amount of goods or provide the same amount of services. And third, They can engage in labor-to-capital substitution. An example is those automated order-taking kiosks, which now exist at some fast food restaurants. At the time of writing in 2016, there were very few of these, but now there are a lot more. There is more than one way the possible avenue of price effects can manifest itself as well. Firms may simply raise the sticker price they charge, but they can also skimp out on quality on the margin as well. I truly wish the world did not have to be this way, but it is. For the record, I fully supported minimum wage laws and thought they should be higher before I learned economics. Historical progression of the minimum wage literature in economics. The economics of the minimum wage has come a long way since George Stigler's 1946 pioneering article kickstarted investigation into the possible impacts of minimum wage legislation. While the topic remained relatively unexplored during the 50s, interest in the effects of minimum wage legislation among academic economists started heating up during the 60s, then picked up still more steam throughout the 70s, with well-known economist Finis Welch publishing his book Minimum Wages, Issues and Evidence in 1978. He wrote a uniquely persuasive 10-page pamphlet called The Rising Impact of Minimum Wages that summarizes his findings and argument in that book. In that aforementioned pamphlet, Welch shares abundant evidence from many prior studies, some conducted by him but not all, on multiple fronts of the potential impacts of minimum wages, but one which can no longer be studied in the United States at present. Because the minimum wage was not originally imposed unilaterally across all sectors and industries when it was first introduced all the way back in 1938, and furthermore that it initially applied to about only 40% of American workers, and most of that initial coverage, that is, which workers the wage floor applied to, was concentrated in just people working in the manufacturing, mining, transportation, or communications industries. This is a perfect setup for a great degree of what econometricians call experimental variation in the conditions, which allow for easier identification of the effects of the policy variable being evaluated, namely of minimum wage laws. Moreover, which types of jobs and workers the minimum wage applied to only expanded very gradually. At the time that The Rising Impact of Minimum Wages was published in 1978, the Fair Labor Standards Act had been amended a total of only 6 times, first in 1950 and the most recently in the previous year, 1977. Each amendment raised the basic hourly minimum, and all those but in 1950 and 1956 also provided for subsequent step increases in the rate. In addition, the 1961, 1966, and 1974 amendments broadened the Act's coverage. This part is very important. They broadened its coverage while smoothing the effects of this by setting lower, though gradually rising, minimums for the newly covered sectors. And its degree of coverage of American workers had increased from a little above 40% in 1938 up to a little above 80% by 1978. Note, as I mentioned back in the introduction, this process continued until 1990, when it was expanded the rest of the way to the entire US workforce, more or less. What Welch shows is that before 1938, teenagers, the largest group with easily available employment and wage data going back that long, who are always likely to be low-skilled workers with or vying for low-wage jobs, quote, generally worked where adults did, and the age distribution of workers across industries was amazingly even by today's standards, end of quote. But this ceased to be the case in a stark fashion by only 1940, just 2 years later. And the degree to which the percentage of teenagers were working in any given industry decreased by 1940 were directly proportional to which industries had the highest percentage coverage under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Moreover, The same thing was true in the other direction as well. In other words, those industries mostly spared from this new minimum wage mandate saw increased shares of the teenage labor force by 1940. To flesh this point out a bit, I include a version of Table 2 from the rising impact of minimum wages I rebuilt myself from scratch in Excel because the version in the original paper appears to have gotten stained, and while it is still readable, it didn't look quite good enough for me to want to include it as is here. You can go to the actual article on my Medium blog to look at the table. As you can see, during the 30s, teenage employment in the United States fell more than the national average in every industry with above average coverage. And correspondingly, in every industry with below average coverage, the decrease in the teenage employment rate was less than the drop in the overall national employment rate for that industry over the same time. Thus, teenage employment not only fell, and of course it did, this was the Great Depression after all, but I'm talking about relatively speaking, a steeper decline than the rest of the workforce. But it also shifted from covered to uncovered sectors within 2 years after the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed. The ramping up of the quantity of empirical research papers on the effects of minimum wage laws published by economists and of the level of econometric rigor on top of the increasing sophistication of the economic analysis throughout the 1970s accumulated in a congressional commission tasked with recruiting hundreds of professional economists to systematically study the effects of minimum wage mandates in the United States. The only analogy I can think of which is likely to be familiar is a much smaller scale IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the UN's climate panel, but instead it's just economists living and working in the United States and only studying the United States, not the whole world, as the UN's climate panel does. The mission published its almost 300-page-long official report, which had been drafted by a team of dozens of professional economists in 1981. Although this was by no means its sole focus, the Commission's official report included a chapter which thoroughly summarized the existing research on the estimated employment effects of the federal minimum wage in the United States. This chapter was based on a review of the literature chiefly conducted by the economists Charles Brown, Curtis Gilroy, and Andrew Cohen, all three of whom were well-respected members of the Congressional Commission's task force. Brown et al., 1982, subsequently published a revised version of their review as a standalone article in the Journal of Economic Literature. In this article, they summarized the previous minimum wage research as suggesting that, quote, time series studies typically find that a 10% increase in the minimum wage reduces teenage employment by 1 to 3%. Page 524, end quote. Subsequently, this 1 to 3% range of increases in the unemployment rate, among teenagers that is, teenagers were chosen because they represent an easily measurable proxy for low-skilled workers on whom data is not directly collected overall, following a 10% bump in the federal minimum wage rate, came to be something of an empirical result / stylized fact agreed upon by most economists worth their salt, that is. A little over a decade later, starting in 1992, several minimum wage studies using innovative methodologies that were not present in the previous minimum wage literature started to be published in prestigious journals that were unable to find any statistically significant evidence for negative employment impacts on low-skilled workers following increases in minimum wages. In fact, a handful of them had results which pointed towards a possibility of mild positive employment effects of minimum wage increases. Part 3. Card and Kruger versus Newmark and Washer. By far, the most prolific scholars of the minimum wage in the last few decades have been the two-man teams of David Card and Alan Kruger versus David Newmark and William Washer. Since the early 90s, Card and Kruger published numerous collaborative minimum wage papers with conclusions contrary to the conventional wisdom of economics on minimum wage laws. They did so in 1992, multiple times, 1994, 95, 98, and 2000, just spanning that decade. Over roughly that same time period, Newmark and Washer have together written many academic articles criticizing what they see as methodological flaws in several key studies conducted by Card and Kruger, in addition to many articles of their own which attempt to estimate the effects of minimum wage laws. Card and Kruger. More than anyone else, it was David Card and Alan Kruger who led the charge in what came to be known as the new minimum wage research, starting in the early 1990s, and still going strong today for the record. Card got the ball rolling with two articles of his in 1992, both about minimum wages, which were published back-to-back in the Industrial and Labor Relations Review. The first of these articles used California's minimum wage hike in 1988 as a case study to measure the effects on employment and earnings. Card finds that the minimum wage increase from $3.35 to $4.25 boosted the earnings among low-wage workers by somewhere between 5 and 10%. However, he was not able to find any indication that teenage employment had declined over the same period. The second, also by Card in 1992, used the 1990 increase in the federal minimum wage rate as a broad treatment effect with varying impacts across states depending on the fraction of their workforce which had been earning below the new minimum wage before it was increased. Again, Card found that while there was a boost to teenagers' wages following the bump in the federal minimum wage, as might be expected, he could find no compelling evidence of corresponding decreases in teenage employment rates or changes in school enrollment rates among teenagers for that matter. Beyond that, there was also a minimum wage study by Katz and Kruger in 1992 as well, which purported to study the impact an increase in the federal minimum wage had on a localized low-wage labor market. As for which low-wage labor market to survey, they chose fast food restaurants in the state of Texas. Katz and Kruger infer 4 key conclusions after analyzing their data. First, their survey results showed that a very small fraction of fast food restaurants utilized the new youth sub-minimum wage, despite the fact that most of them had been paying hourly rates below the new minimum before it went into effect. Second, the 1990 to 91 federal minimum wage increases have compressed the distribution of starting wages in the Texas fast food industry. Third, relative employment increased in firms deemed likely to have been most impacted by the 1991 minimum wage hike. Fourth, variation in prices charged for meals do not appear to be associated with enforced changes in wage requirements. As the authors note, these results seem to be quite inconsistent with conventional, read neoclassical, expectations of the effects of an increase in a binding wage floor. Just 2 years later, Card and Kruger published their landmark article, Minimum Wages and Employment, Case Study of the Fast Food Industry in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Since it was published, this paper has been cited well over 2,000 times. The methodology used in this study was highly original for its time. They exploited a substantial increase in New Jersey's state minimum wage rate over a time period in which the adjacent state, Pennsylvania, had no changes in its specific minimum wage policy. Employment in the fast food industry was chosen as a proxy for unskilled labor in general, so specifically designed surveys were sent out to the managers or owners of 410 fast food restaurants in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, asking them various questions about number of employees, employee hours, and prices charged for popular items on their menus. Like the two earlier articles by Card, in this article, Card and Kruger find, quote, no indication that the rise in the minimum wage reduced unemployment, unquote. Building off their recent momentum, in 1995, Card and Kruger published a brief yet daring meta-analysis of past time series minimum wage studies. This was quite significant because most of the empirical minimum wage studies done before the 90s were conducted using time series econometric techniques. In their meta-analysis, Card and Kruger present suggestive evidence that the time series minimum wage literature might have been affected by a one-two punch of publication bias and specification searching. If true, this would indicate a tendency toward an overrepresentation of statistically significant results throughout the published literature. After that, Card and Kruger thought they might as well write a whole damn book about what they called the New Economics of the Minimum Wage. This book, Myth and Measurement, 1995, sent shockwaves throughout the economics community by simultaneously challenging foundational concepts and calling into question the academic integrity of many earlier minimum wage scholars. And that is not all. The book genuinely proposed several alternative models of the labor market which could account for their seemingly anomalous results. Coincidentally, perhaps, this follows from Thomas Kuhn's model of how revolutionary scientific paradigms emerged to a T. Newmark and Washer, the chief modern-day defenders of the standard neoclassical account of minimum wage laws, are David Newmark and William Washer. Not surprisingly, this resulted in Newmark and Washer becoming the arch-nemeses of Card and Kruger. The first collaborative minimum wage article by Newmark and Washer was published in 1992. This article was a panel data study. A panel data is what statisticians call longitudinal data. It is a cohort of the same fixed persons over a period of time. It's like a combination between cross-sectional and time series data. Anyway, this article was a panel data study on the employment effects of state-level minimum and sub-minimum wages. Elasticity estimates of employment to population ratios with respect to minimum wages for teenagers aged 16 to 19 lie between negative 0.1 and negative 0.2. In other words, according to their estimates, a 10% increase in the minimum wage is associated with a 1 to 2% drop in teenage employment. This range of elasticity estimates for teenagers is in line with those estimated in earlier time series estimates from the 70s and 80s. For young adults aged 16 to 24, their estimated range of possible elasticities goes from negative 0.15 to negative 0.2. Then, this paper directly calls into question the anomalous results found in Card's two papers from 1992. Possible flaws in the econometric specifications used in Card's early studies, which could bias results upward, are illuminated. Newmark and Washer also point out how their results in this paper stand in stark contrast to what they call the puzzling finding reported in Katz and Kruger's 1992 article, which was published in the same journal as this Newmark and Washer article for the record, that most Texas fast food joints opted not to utilize the federal subminimum wage introduced in 1990. These were essentially the first shots fired across the bow. To make a long story short, Newmark and Washer subsequently published several articles directly criticizing several of Card and Kruger's articles in the same journals as the originals were published. Newmark and Washer 1992, 1994, 1998, and 2000. The reply articles critiqued everything from generalizability of results, or what economists usually call external validity, the quality of the data collected via surveys, possible difference between what managers remember doing and what they actually did, the validity of testing for publication bias via direct meta-analysis of previous time series minimum wage studies, shortness of time horizon studied, failure to adequately check for lagged effects of minimum wage increases, etc. A back and forth battle fought through academic journal articles ensued, Newmark and Washer versus Card and Kruger. Details of the battle are too numerous to include here in full, but, as is all too common in academic debates, both duos had teams of supporters behind them. Once an economist picked Team Card and Kruger, he usually just so happened to find their methodologies more rigorous and their evidence more convincing. How curious. Something similar happened to the economists who aligned themselves with Newmark and Washer. The most comprehensive minimum wage literature review since the early 80s was in fact authored by Newmark and Washer. Their 167-page monograph was simply called Minimum Wages and Employment, published in Foundations and Trends in Microeconomics in 2007. Although this paper purported to, quote, review the burgeoning literature on employment effects of minimum wages in the United States and in other countries, that was spurred by the new minimum wage research beginning in the early 1990s, end of quote, it was not a meta-analysis in the literal sense that combined data sets used in a bunch of different articles and ran econometric tests on this massive combined data set. It was closer to a longer, more detailed version of the paper I am typing right now. It's more of a qualitative and quantitative literature review. The fact that this review of minimum wage research after 1990 was written by men who were themselves major contributors to the literature under reviewed is a double-edged sword. On one hand, Newmark and Washer clearly had some reputational skin in the game, which could have biased their findings towards concurring with the papers with similar methodologies and conclusions to their own papers. On the other hand, the fact that they were key players in this space undoubtedly gave them significant knowledge advantages over other economists who had never done any academic work on the minimum wage. Being a review of such magnitude, there were far too many findings, i.e., summaries of the findings by themselves, and other economists to write an exhaustive list here. There were, however, several findings which stood out from the rest. First, the range of the elasticity of teenage employment with respect to the minimum wage. Estimates in the new minimum wage research went from almost negative 1.0 to above 0. This stood in stark contrast to the negative 0.3 to negative 0.1 range, within which most of the estimates reviewed in the Brown et al. 1982 paper covered. Of the 102 studies surveyed in their summary table, roughly 2/3 of them provide a consistent indication of negative employment effects of minimum wages, and only 8 of them give a consistent indication of positive employment effects. Second, there are serious issues with generalizing minimum wage effects found in articles which employ the case study approach pioneered by Card and Kruger. The reservations voiced by numerous economists. See, for example, the Reviews of Myth and Measurement by Brown et al., 1995, and Deere and Murphy and Welch, 1995, regarding the generalizability of the results from articles employing the case study approach coming out of the so-called new minimum wage research program. This is in addition to the problem posed by the fact that Card and Kruger and many other studies in this research program only focused on the employment effects of minimum wage laws, given the ambiguous predictions the standard competitive model makes for the employment effects of minimum wages in specific industries whose employees comprise only a minor subset of all low-wage workers. This makes inferences about the impacts these minimum wage hikes had on low-skilled workers in general impossible without first making several dubious assumptions lacking empirical bases. In other words, while it may be the case that the case study approach used in the new minimum wage research program was innovative and clever for its time, originality alone is not enough to ensure valid or useful results. Third, The importance of accounting for labor-to-labor substitution within groups of low-wage workers. The tradition of using teenage employment figures as an easily available proxy for data on low-wage workers as a whole in the minimum wage literature goes back quite a long time. But we must keep in mind they are not strictly speaking equivalent categories. Not all teens are low-wage workers. In fact, most teenagers do not have a job, and many of them never get one in their teens, and not every low-wage worker is a teen. In some of the literature surveyed by Newmark and Washer, attempts are made to identify these labor-to-labor substitution effects directly. In other parts, specific attention is given to workers whose wages and employment prospects are judged most likely to be affected by the minimum wage. Preliminary estimates from this line of inquiry lend support to the notion that firms replace their lowest skilled labor with whatever close substitutes are available following an increase in the binding wage floor. As they put it in the first sentence of the final paragraph in the conclusion section to their mammoth minimum wage review paper, quote, "In sum, we view the literature, when read broadly and critically, as largely solidifying the view that minimum wages reduce employment of low-skilled workers, and as suggesting that the low-wage labor market can be reasonably approximated by the neoclassical competitive model." End of quote. While perhaps not the most unbiased review of minimum wage scholarship out there, this is by far the most exhaustive review of the developments in the field since the emergence of the new minimum wage research program. But be that as it may, this article was published in 2007. That was 10 years ago at the time this paper was originally written. Now it's about 17 or 18 years ago. So it did not cover any of the minimum wage studies published since then. Part 4. Innovative new approaches for assessing the effects of minimum wage laws. I. Measuring the impacts of city-specific minimum wage rates on firm exit in the restaurant industry. One recent working paper by Luca and Luca in 2017 seeks to exploit recent changes in the minimum wage at the city level to measure its impact on exit rates among restaurants in the city of varying quality, determined by how many stars the restaurant has received on Yelp. Its findings were that a $1 increase in the city-level minimum wage leads to a corresponding increase in exit rates among restaurants in that city of somewhere between 4 and 10%, though statistical significance fails when city-specific time trends and time-varying county-level characteristics are controlled for. When separating restaurants into two groups, those of medium quality, represented by a 3.5-star rating on Yelp, and those of superb quality, restaurants with 5-star Yelp ratings, their point estimates suggest that a $1 increase in the city-level minimum wage leads to a 14% increase in the likelihood of exit for a 3.5-star restaurant, but has no identifiable impact for a 5-star restaurant. These heterogeneous impacts of the minimum wage on restaurant exit by restaurant quality, showing that the impact on exit is concentrated among lower quality restaurants, that is, those which are already closer to the margin of exit, constitutes compelling evidence of the disproportionate ill effects binding minimum wages have on low-skilled workers as predicted by the standard textbook model wage floors. Part II. Using cross-state discrepancies in impacts from changes in federal minimum wages on effective state-specific minimum wage ordinances. Baskaya and Rubenstein in 2012 take the strategy of using state-specific minimum wages and flip it on its head. Instead of using the methodology developed in the new minimum wage literature, where state-effective minimum wage rates are used opportunistically to evaluate their consequences on employment and earnings, Baskaya and Rubenstein use changes in federal minimum wage rates that affect effective nominal wage floors in some states more than others to identify and estimate the impact of minimum wage ordinances on employment and possibly uncover biases in previous research. Baskaya and Rubinstein estimate the long-run elasticity of employment with respect to federal minimum wages to be approximately -1. This elasticity estimate proves robust to adding in regional year effects, state-specific long-run trends, and differential time effects for states that were always restricted by federal minimum wages. Robust, large effect sizes such as these tell us that minimum wages do matter. Interestingly, they find no evidence for employment effects on the heels of changes in state effective minimum wages in either the long run or the short run. This finding is consistent with those from previous studies coming out of the new minimum wage research program. This can be explained by the possible endogeneity of changes in state effective minimum wage rates. It is possible that more prosperous states with stronger labor markets are more likely to increase their state's specific minimum wage rates than are struggling states with relatively weak labor markets. The way the authors put it is thus, quote, from the evaluation perspective, accounting for the endogenous determination of effective minimum wage rates at the state level turns out to be materially important for drawing accurate inferences about the impact of labor floor prices on the employment prospects of low-paid workers, end of quote. III, subsection, differential employment impacts of the federal minimum wage dependent on age and level of educational attainment. Another innovative approach to identifying and estimating the employment impacts of minimum wage laws comes from a 2013 paper written by econometrician Anthony Davies, which partitions American workers into groups defined by age and levels of academic achievement. From there, unemployment rates are regressed on effective federal minimum wage rates for each age and educational partition. His results show that unemployment rates among workers with college diplomas are not correlated with federal minimum wage rates. This is what he and other economists would predict given the wages earned by those with college educations, given that they graduate and earn at least a bachelor's degree, which is what he used as his cutoff. And as expected, there was a slight positive correlation between unemployment and the federal minimum rate among workers with only a high school diploma. Furthermore, there was a significant positive correlation in the data between the unemployment rate and the level of minimum wage for American workers without high school diplomas, and still a higher positive correlation between unemployment and minimum wage rates for workers who were both under 25 years of age and did not have a high school diploma. The fourth example of an interesting new methodological study is Effects of Minimum Wages on Employment Dynamics by Meir and West in 2015. In that paper, they argued that rather than impacting relative employment levels, it might be more realistic to expect an increased minimum wage to impact employment over time through changes in employment growth rates. Meir and West show that, quote, commonly used specifications in this literature, especially those that include state-specific time trends, will not accurately capture these dynamical effects, end of quote. Their analysis uses several different empirical specifications, all tested on 3 different state panels of administrative employment data, and demonstrate that minimum wages can reduce job growth rates over a period of several years. These results appear to be robust. Furthermore, they demonstrate that the common practice in the minimum wage literature of controlling for jurisdiction-specific time trends biases estimates of employment growth towards zero. Put differently, they show that many of the econometric specifications used in prior literature will err systematically if the true effects of minimum wages are dynamic in nature. In order to help explain the difference between the hypothesis that minimum wage increases cause decreases in employment levels and the alternative hypothesis that minimum wage hikes cause a reduction in employment growth rates, at least compared to the counterfactual employment growth rates in the absence of the minimum wage increase, I am taking the liberty of reprinting 3 diagrams from me and West's appendix below. They aim to visually show the difference between a minimum wage having an impact on employment levels versus a minimum wage which instead impacts employment growth rates. I shall include these graphs in the YouTube video, as you should see them right now, but you can also see them in the article on my blog. There are 3 of them. Figure 3 is the third one, figure 4 is the second, and figure 5 is the third. Part 5. Conclusion. Those who call for higher minimum wage rates at the federal, local, and even city level no doubt see themselves as fighting for the poor. They think of themselves as virtuous rebels fighting back against rapacious employers. Sadly, as often is the case, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Opposition among academic economists to legal minimum wages is and has always been the majority position. This innate hostility to minimum wages by economists is not political in nature. Rather, it is grounded in basic economic analysis and bolstered by a spate of empirical findings on the matter. For the most part, results from studies which attempt to quantify the impacts of minimum wages point to non-trivial disemployment outcomes for low-skilled workers. This ought to surprise no one, considering this is precisely what sound, experimentally vindicated economic theory predicts. As Deere et al. 1995 emphatically put it, quote, "The prediction that an artificial increase in the price of something causes less of it to be purchased is the most fundamental prediction in all of economics. It is called the law of demand." End of quote. It is natural for people to want to feel like they support policies which, quote, "help the poor," unquote. However vacuously this is defined in their head. But what is more important to poor people in the real world, as opposed to the imaginary ones inside one's head, is a question whose answer lies in empirical reality and solid and sound economic theory. Finding out what reliably helps impoverished people and what makes them worse off through rigorous inquiry rather than merely using plausibility as their sole guiding star would go a long way towards substantiating the morally righteous self-images of these misguided citizens. The end.